They found her last husband half dissolved in the cellar brine. That was the line whispered through Millfield, Kentucky in the autumn of 1863, a quiet farming town that had become a field hospital, a graveyard, and a stage for one of the most methodical murder operations in American history. You weren't supposed to hear this. The official reports were burned, the church records sealed. But somewhere, behind the veil of Civil War heroism and sanctified grief, a woman named Constance Grimsley discovered a formula not for love, but for the disposal of husbands. She was called the Widow of Millfield, a woman whose touch could calm the dying and hasten their deaths. When the Union Army began tallying her marriages against her funerals, the pattern was so obscene, so mathematically precise, that even the military chaplains refused to speak her name. But this isn't just a story about a woman killing soldiers for money. It's a mirror reflecting something much older, much deeper: the first American experiment in emotional control, financial extraction, and spiritual inversion. You see, Constance wasn't merely poisoning men. She was testing obedience. She was studying the psychology of trust, loyalty, and submission long before psychology had a name. And someone was studying her. There's a reason her medical recipes read like early intelligence manuals. There's a reason military physicians from both sides were exchanging encrypted letters about her methods. And there's a reason every investigator who tried to expose her died under identical, mysterious fevers. History buries its architects, not its accidents. The deeper you look into Constance's life, the more you realize she wasn't working alone. They say her formula was written in code: dosage, temperature, timing, and affection. Every experiment began the same way, with touch, confession, and the illusion of safety. She built her victims' love as carefully as she measured their poison. And when their hearts swelled with gratitude, she delivered the final dose through faith, through tenderness, through the hand of mercy. That's how real control works. Not through force, but through comfort. By the time her seventh husband died, Constance had rewritten the science of submission, turning love itself into a weapon. And if you think that weapon stayed buried in 1863, you're not ready for what comes next. They say Millfield was built on limestone, porous, soft, and hungry for what the earth gives it. Maybe that's why it swallowed its secrets so easily. The soldiers who came through its streets were half dead already, bleeding ghosts in blue and gray uniforms. To them, Constance Grimsley wasn't a danger, she was a promise. A woman in a pale blue dress who smelled of lavender oil and spoke like scripture. When she arrived in the spring of 1862, she brought no husband, no children, no witnesses. Just a carpet bag, a letter of recommendation from a Presbyterian minister who no one could later identify, and a small leather-bound book she never let out of her sight. Inside that book, the Grimsley Ledger, were pages of coded experiments disguised as medicinal recipes. Extracts from foxglove, aconite, belladonna, each annotated with what appeared to be battlefield notes. But these weren't field treatments, they were field trials. She tested on the wounded, the dying, the forgotten, and they thanked her for it. What she discovered was that death, when delivered gently, feels like healing. The victim's heart slows under the illusion of care. The mind drifts into gratitude. And by the time the body realizes it's dying, it's too late to resist. That was Constance's genius. Not her cruelty, her control. She understood something men in power would later codify into entire institutions. If you want to kill resistance, give it comfort. Doctors at the time called her the Angel of Mercy. But the letters found decades later between Union and Confederate surgeons painted another picture, one of fascination and fear. They weren't trying to stop her. They were trying to understand her, to replicate her results. Because in the chaos of war, control becomes more valuable than victory. One surgeon wrote, "She achieves obedience without command. They die thanking her." Another noted that her methods could neutralize will itself, not through pain, but through trust. Do you see it now? Constance Grimsley wasn't a local anomaly. She was a prototype. A century before the world heard of MKUltra, before behavioral conditioning, before state-funded hypnosis. There was a woman in Kentucky proving that love, faith, and medicine could all serve the same master: control. And someone somewhere kept her notes. By the summer of 1862, Millfield had become a funnel, a quiet vortex pulling the wounded, the lost, and the dying straight into Constance Grimsley's care. The town's Methodist church had been turned into a field hospital, its altar replaced by tables stained brown with blood and iodine. The hymnals were gone, but the prayers continued, whispered by men who mistook agony for redemption. And through it all, Constance moved like a specter of mercy. She knew exactly where to press, when to whisper, how to meet the eyes of a man who was too far gone to hope but too afraid to die. That's how she found her first husband, Private Thomas Kellerman, a farm boy turned soldier whose leg wound had become a slow rot of infection. Witnesses said he smiled again when Constance entered his room, that he called her the light after Shiloh. For weeks later, he was dead. The death certificate blamed gastric fever. The townspeople blamed God. But those who examined his body before it was hurriedly buried noted strange marks along his arms. Tiny punctures, as if he had been bled or injected. When Dr. Patterson mentioned this to Constance, she wept so convincingly that he apologized to her for the suggestion. Within days, she had moved on to another soldier, another patient. Another test. The journals found years later in her attic weren't diaries. They were progress reports, detailed notations on how long it took for each compound to act, what emotions preceded the onset of paralysis, what final words were spoken before the heart ceased. And written across one page in delicate, unwavering ink. The mind must first submit before the body can follow. That sentence would later appear almost verbatim in early 20th century psychological warfare manuals credited to anonymous sources. But it didn't start in a lab or a military think tank. It started in a boarding house bedroom under the pale hands of a woman pretending to pray. Think about that. She was mapping human vulnerability in real time, translating affection into anesthesia, trust into toxin, love into laboratory data. And every man who died beneath her care became another equation solved. Constance Grimsley wasn't just surviving the war. She was perfecting something within it, something that would outlive her, outlive the century, and reappear under 1,000 names in 1,000 programs. Because once you understand how to make people love their destroyer, you don't need to pull a trigger again. It's easy to dismiss her now, to say she was a poisoner, a manipulator, a madwoman. But madness doesn't write equations. It doesn't leave blueprints. And that's exactly what Constance Grimsley left behind, a set of procedures so precise, so systematic, that even her crimes feel less like murders and more like controlled experiments. By autumn, her influence stretched beyond Millfield. Wounded soldiers from Tennessee and Ohio were requesting transfer to the House of the Kind Widow. Local doctors called it divine favor. Military superiors called it coincidence. But in her private ledger, Constance wrote one chilling phrase beside each new patient's name: subject acquired. She categorized them not by injury, but by temperament. The devout, the defiant, the malleable, each received a different mixture. Some through tinctures, some through poultices, and some through the one ritual every man trusts, the evening drink. And she always watched, always recorded. Her notes on the defiant are the most disturbing. They resist longer, but their defiance is pride, not conviction. Once the illusion of choice is removed, even the strongest yield to comfort. That line, the illusion of choice, echoes through history like a curse. You've seen it in your own time, in politics, in advertising, in the way power offers you two paths, both leading to the same master. Constance didn't invent control. She simply personalized it. Witnesses later claimed she could make a man confess anything with her eyes alone. That she once convinced a Union sergeant to burn his enlistment papers just so he could die as a free man. A man who perished 3 nights later from herbal complications. But you see, Constance's genius wasn't just in the chemistry of poison. It was in the chemistry of belief. She realized that once people believe they are choosing their fate, you can guide them anywhere, even into their own destruction. And she proved that the same formula that kills a body can pacify a nation. Because after her came others, doctors, priests, scientists who learned from her structure, not her sin. They studied how she made her victims grateful for the hand that ended them. How she cloaked obedience in love, silence and grace, and poison in the language of salvation. She was no ordinary widow. She was the mother of a system. By winter, the snow in Millfield turned gray with ash smoke from the field hospital fires, from the burning Let 314 RS, from the quiet erasure of evidence. The war was raging across Kentucky, but inside the Grimsley boarding rooms, another kind of war was being fought. The war for possession of the human will. And in that war, Constance was undefeated. Every husband died the same way, praising her. The town minister even wrote, "No soul could hope for a more merciful end than in the arms of Mrs. Grimsley." Mercy, that's what they called it. And that's what every empire calls it when it destroys something in the name of care. Her methods were spreading. Dr. Patterson began replicating her herbal mixtures, unaware that she was altering his ratios when he wasn't looking. Local nurses tried to learn her techniques, but none could replicate her results. She told them it was faith, but her journal told a different story, an early understanding of neurotoxic interaction, something centuries ahead of its time. Yet the real secret wasn't the poison. It was what came before the poison. She would begin by breaking isolation, sitting with the men in silence, creating a rhythm of safety. Then came touch, the cooling cloth, the gentle pulse check, the illusion of intimacy. And finally, the promise of healing. That was the moment they surrendered. That's when she dosed them. You think that formula died with her? Look around. It's the same pattern used by modern systems that claim to protect you, calm the panic, build the bond, then feed you the dose that keeps you compliant. Every institution learned from her. Government, religion, media, medicine. The same rhythm, the same mercy, the same illusion. It's said that before her fifth husband died, a Confederate courier named Elias read, he whispered to a friend, "She told me not to fight it." That rest was the only victory left. He wasn't talking about dying. He was talking about surrender. When the chaplain came to bless his body, he found her sitting beside the bed, eyes open, lips moving soundlessly as if reciting something older than prayer. Some witnesses swore the room smelled faintly of lilac and copper. Others claimed she smiled when they closed the coffin, because Constance knew the truth buried deeper than any war. Once you convince a man that surrender is salvation, he'll hand you his soul willingly. After her fifth husband's burial, something shifted in Millfield. The air grew heavy with rumor. Even those who once praised her began to feel uneasy in her presence. The church bells that tolled for her dead no longer sounded like mourning, they sounded like a metronome counting down. The doctor drank more. The minister stammered through sermons. And still, Constance smiled, the picture of piety. The model widow. The town saw only what she allowed them to see, because Constance had discovered something far more intoxicating than poison. The power of narrative. Every death was wrapped in a story, a tale of faith, sacrifice, divine timing. She controlled the script, the tone, the witnesses. And when you control the story, you control memory itself. She knew it instinctively. People don't believe what they see. They believe what they need to believe to feel safe. That's how she survived 7 husbands. That's how she made the entire town complicit, each mourner feeding the myth that kept her untouchable. She didn't hide her crimes. She reframed them. Sound familiar? It should. Because that same mechanism operates on you today. The same elegant manipulation, guilt coded in virtue, compliance masked as care, destruction dressed as devotion. It's the same voice that says, "This is for your safety." The same face that smiles as it takes from you. What Constance practiced in that small Kentucky town was not unique. It was a rehearsal, an early draft of the global theater we live in now. She proved that people will guard their own chains if you convince them the chains are holy. Her experiments didn't just kill men. They killed discernment. They proved how fragile perception is when drenched in emotion. Because once the townspeople began to doubt her, she turned that doubt into pity. She cried. She spoke of loneliness. She invited them to protect her. And they did. The same men who buried her husbands began defending her honor. That's when you realize she wasn't reacting to danger, she was managing psychology. History calls her a murderer. But the documents found in 1923, those sealed letters between army surgeons and state investigators, use a different word. They called her a pioneer of persuasive medicine. And one margin note inside, written in black iron ink reads, "Continue correspondence. The subject displays remarkable understanding of mass response." Constance Grimsley wasn't erased from history. She was absorbed into it. The final winter of the war came hard to Kentucky snow on graves, smoke in lungs, rot beneath the floorboards. Yet Constance thrived. While soldiers froze in the hills, her home glowed with lamplight and hymns. She had become a kind of shrine, a saint of suffering. And saints, as you know, make excellent weapons. That winter brought her sixth husband, Corporal Nathaniel Dorr, a young Union courier with a trembling hand and a poet's soul. He'd survived Antietam, but not her attention. She found him delirious, coughing blood, and within a week, she had him believing that God himself had led him to her. His last journal entry, still preserved in the Millfield Historical Society, reads, "She is mercy made flesh. If I die here, I die saved." He did die. The next day, Dr. Patterson's notes from that autopsy, his last recorded one, described unusual crystallization in the victim's blood, something he'd never seen before. He sent samples to a Confederate medical officer in Nashville for analysis. The response came back empty. No explanation. Just a single line scrawled at the bottom of the returned letter. "Stop asking questions. She serves a higher commission." Who wrote it, no one knows. But after that, Dr. Patterson went silent. Within 2 weeks, he too was dead. The official cause? Heart failure. But those who saw his body said his lips were blackened, the same discoloration that marked every one of Constance's husbands. And that's when the letters began, anonymous and signed, all written in the same careful script. They were addressed to Union intelligence officers, chaplains, and regional governors. Each letter contained fragments of her formula, not the chemical recipe, but the psychological sequence. 4 steps repeated in every note: isolation, dependency, devotion, termination. Sound familiar? It should. It's the skeleton of every manipulation system since the core of propaganda, the rhythm of cults, the invisible handshake between those who lead and those who obey. But those letters weren't warnings. They were recruitment tools. Constance was no longer just a widow. She was a myth in motion, the embodiment of power disguised as compassion. And if you've ever wondered why institutions that claim to save you also seem to weaken you, trace the pattern back to her. Because long before the word psychology entered textbooks, she'd already mastered the formula that still governs the world: the marriage of care and control. When the war ended, Millfield emptied. Soldiers limped home to ghost towns and hollow promises, and Constance Grimsley, the sainted widow, vanished. No arrest, no trial, just absence. But absence, in her case, wasn't disappearance. It was migration. Records from St. Louis in 1866 mention a Mrs. C.G. Remsen, a widow caring for convalescent officers in a private home for invalid veterans. The handwriting on the intake forms matches hers exactly. And so the experiment continued quietly, efficiently, under a new name. The war may have ended, but her laboratory had only expanded. Now she had resources: federal pensions, pharmaceutical shipments, and the endless parade of broken men eager for healing. But something had changed in her writings. The later pages of her ledger move from chemistry to philosophy. The poisons fade. The principles sharpen. She begins to describe behavioral contagion. How one man's submission, once observed by another, can replicate like infection. She wrote, "Obedience spreads through witness. They learn surrender by watching it rewarded. That's not medicine. That's social engineering." She began speaking at local temperance meetings, church gatherings, reform societies, always under aliases, always cloaked in virtue. And the same faces who once guarded her husband's coffins now sat before her, nodding in agreement as she preached the holiness of discipline, the peace of compliance, the divine calling of sacrifice. They thought they were hearing a sermon. They were hearing a manual. In one preserved transcript from 1868, attributed to Mrs. Remsen of St. Louis, she told her audience, A nation divided by rebellion can only heal when every soul accepts the yoke willingly. To resist mercy is to resist order. That line, resist mercy, resist order, later appeared in the charter of a post-war Reconstruction society tied to both Northern industrialists and Southern clergy. Coincidence? No. Continuation. Constance had evolved beyond murder. She no longer needed to kill men to test control. She was now shaping their beliefs, infecting institutions with her formula. And if you think her teachings died in that century, remember this: every system that preaches comfort before freedom, every movement that demands obedience in the name of peace, every authority that asks you to surrender your instincts for the greater good, they're echoing her words. Now, before we go deeper, I want you to prove something to yourself and to the algorithm that watches everything. Comment this phrase twice below. Mercy is the mask of power. Write it twice, not for me, but for your mind, to mark that you've seen through the first layer. Because from here on, the descent begins. By the early 1870s, Constance Grimsley had become something else, not a woman, not even a legend, but a framework. She existed through proxies, protégés, and papers passed hand to hand in secret women's societies and benevolent associations. Her name was scrubbed from public memory, but her methods were not. They metastasized. Letters discovered in 1923, hidden behind a courthouse wall during renovation, reveal the correspondence between 3 former military surgeons, all men who'd served in Millfield. The letters reference the widow's protocol, a term they used interchangeably with the psychological sequence. Each described experiments on soldiers suffering from what we'd now call trauma. But they weren't healing them. They were testing them. The men wrote, "She taught us that broken minds seek new masters. Offer them order, and they will pay with obedience." It's the birth of post-war social programming, the idea that control doesn't require chains when the heart craves structure. That formula would echo again through the 20th century in asylums, factories, schools, even churches. And at the center of it all, the same architecture: isolation, dependency, devotion, termination. Her 4-step pattern became policy, a blueprint for reconstruction of spirit. But reconstruction was just a cleaner word for conditioning. It didn't stop with veterans. By 1874, widows' clinics were quietly operating in Nashville, Richmond, and Washington. Their purpose? Moral rehabilitation. Their result? Obedience disguised as salvation. A Senate subcommittee years later discovered that these clinics were receiving funding from industrial families and pharmaceutical suppliers, the same names that would dominate the next century of medicine and propaganda. The names change. The doctrine never does. Because power learned something essential from Constance: that loyalty is most absolute when it feels voluntary. Her private papers, never meant to surface, describe it as the gentle hand theory. She wrote, "A man resists force, but he worships comfort. So long as comfort speaks softly, he will kneel without knowing why." Every modern apparatus of persuasion, from televised fear campaigns to the language of corporate wellness, carries that same rhythm, that same narcotic tone of protection. Constance didn't just dissolve husbands in cellar brine. She dissolved resistance itself and bottled what remained. So ask yourself, what do you worship because it comforts you? What gentle hand have you mistaken for mercy? By 1877, the world had forgotten Constance Grimsley's name, but not her influence. She had vanished into the folds of polite society, reappearing only in rumor and rumor's shadow. There were whispers of her running a refuge for soldiers' widows near New Orleans. Others claimed she had gone north, living under the identity of a physician's wife in Pennsylvania. But the truth is simpler and far more dangerous. She no longer needed to exist physically at all. Her teachings had entered the bloodstream of power. Think of how infection spreads: one wound, one breath, one whisper at a time. Constance's formula traveled the same way. The journals of Civil War medics became case studies for early psychiatric institutions. Military officers who'd once buried her victims became policymakers shaping rehabilitation programs for the broken and obedient. Even pulpits began to echo her tone: salvation through surrender, peace through submission. Her legacy hid inside language. Phrases like, "for your own good," necessary order, and benevolent authority, all birthed from her doctrine of compassionate coercion. And the brilliance of her system? It required no enforcers, only believers, because belief does what bullets never can. It rewrites reality. In 1881, a secret memorandum surfaced among federal archives and signed, heavily redacted, referencing a Grimsley sequence used in moral stabilization projects across Reconstruction territories. One marginal note reads, "Her principles align with national unification goals. Recommend continuation under administrative cover." That's not conspiracy. That's bureaucracy. The absorption of one woman's pathology into the language of progress. You see, the widow of Millfield wasn't an anomaly. She was an early iteration of a universal principle. That those who can comfort you can also control you. She learned to weaponize empathy, to wrap power in tenderness, domination in devotion. And the men who studied her carried that gift into boardrooms, churches, laboratories, and parliaments. It's no accident that the same structure she tested on dying soldiers now governs entire populations. You just call it policy, programming, persuasion, but it's all the same thing. Isolation, dependency, devotion, termination. Only now it's not your body that's dying. It's your discernment. You've been taught to call obedience enlightenment, to thank those who drain you, to kneel before the hands that bind you. That's the real inheritance of Constance Grimsley. Not her poisons, not her ledger, but her discovery that a soul that seeks safety will sacrifice its freedom willingly. By the dawn of the 20th century, Constance Grimsley's doctrine had shed its skin again, moving from whispers and clinics into institutions that shaped nations. Her writings, or what survived of them, began to circulate within private reform clubs and medical circles under sanitized titles: behavioral restoration, maternal guidance method, and adaptive conditioning. Every version sounded cleaner, safer, more clinical, but each one followed the same fourfold pattern: isolation, dependency, devotion, termination. Now it wasn't just soldiers or widows under her influence, it was the citizenry itself. Industrial schooling adopted her theories without knowing their origin. Obedience became virtue. Initiative became disruption. The child who followed rules was rehabilitated. The child who resisted, defective. You can trace it like a genealogy. 1870s moral clinics, 1890s education reform, 1910s public relations, 1930s propaganda, 1950s televised morality, 21st century algorithmic empathy, all of it humming with the same tune, the gentle hand theory. A document archived under the War Department's Rehabilitation Branch, 1919, cites an unnamed female consultant whose behavioral models were used in the re-education of shell-shocked soldiers. The marginalia beside her quoted words: "Through repetition and reward, resistance decays." You've heard that phrasing before, haven't you? It's in every self-help manual, every training seminar, every onboarding video. Only now it's called habit formation. The language has softened, but the machinery hasn't. And this is where the descent becomes personal. Because Constance's genius wasn't in torture or murder. It was in teaching her victims to love their captors. That's how her method endured, by being mistaken for care. Think about it. The corporation that empowers you while tracking your emotions. The state that protects you by curating your reality. The influencer who heals you while harvesting your attention. Every one of them wears her face. The widow of Millfield isn't gone. She's just digitized. She doesn't need to whisper from a pulpit anymore. She hums through every device, every feed, every notification that soothes you into submission. You've already felt her hand, not cruel, not cold, but comforting. And that comfort is your collar. Before we move further, before you learn how deep her experiment still runs, pause. Turn your camera off. Dim the screen. Listen to the hum behind your thoughts. If you can hear the static, the pulse of something waiting for obedience, you're still human. If you can't, you've already joined her congregation. By the 1920s, the name Grimsley had become a ghost note in bureaucratic archives, buried beneath new departments and prettier words. But what she created, the behavioral lattice, had become the unseen skeleton of modern order. And somewhere in those files, a symbol began to appear. A simple sigil, a circle split by a downward-pointing triangle. At first, it was used on clinic letterheads and psychiatric reports. Then, without attribution, it migrated into early corporate emblems, military diagrams, even the watermark of an educational grant from 1932. The emblem was officially described as a sign of harmony between care and structure. But to those who knew the widow's private symbology, it meant something far more chilling: containment through compassion. That phrase is found scrawled in the margins of a 1914 field manual for Army psychologists attributed to a Mrs. C.R. No one questioned the initials. Around this time, another pattern emerged. Unconnected foundations began funding studies into collective obedience and herd recovery. Their research claimed to strengthen communities after trauma earthquakes, wars, depressions, but the methodology echoed Constance's language exactly. One 1928 memorandum reads, "Emotional unification can be achieved by emphasizing dependence on shared authority. Individual resistance presents as pathology." Do you see it? How her fourfold pattern: isolation, dependency, devotion, termination became civic policy. A society raised to mistake control for healing. Constance Grimsley's disciples no longer met in basements or hospitals. They met in offices and universities. They wore white coats and carried clipboards. They called their obedience progress. Her work had gone viral centuries before the word existed. And then, in 1935, a photograph surfaced. Found in an old asylum record, it shows a lecture hall filled with nurses, all seated in perfect symmetry. At the podium stands a woman sharp-featured, immaculate, ageless. The note on the back reads, "Guest instructor, 1935. Subject, the gentle hand theory." No one ever confirmed her identity, but look closely: her eyes, her posture, her impossible calm. If it wasn't Constance herself, then it was her mirror, her method, made flesh again. From there, her ideology slid quietly through the 20th century into motivational psychology, political strategy, religious revivalism, and the birth of public relations. Every time you were told to trust the process, follow the guidance, or find peace in surrender, her formula was whispering underneath. The widow of Millfield became immortal not through worship but through repetition. She taught the world that control could be tender, that power spoken softly sounds like love, and love repeated long enough can erase memory. The truth of Constance Grimsley's survival was never meant to be written, only reenacted. You've seen it without seeing it. In classrooms that teach obedience, in advertisements that promise safety, in governments that cradle you before they cage you. Every system that begins with comfort ends with quiet consent. After 1935, references to the gentle hand theory multiply, appearing in corporate management manuals, pastoral care bulletins, even early film scripts commissioned for Army morale. A particular training reel, Harmony Under Pressure, distributed in 1944, describes how to guide subordinates through fear into gratitude. The narrator repeats one line 3 times. "They will thank you for the chains if you fit them with kindness." That line, word for word, was written in Constance's journal in 1862. Her presence had evolved from flesh to philosophy. She didn't need a body anymore. She had structure. By the mid-20th century, her formula had become self-replicating. Corporations called it human relations management. Governments called it behavioral integration. Churches called it graceful obedience. Every name a veil for the same principle: the perfection of soft control. And then came the final stage: termination disguised as transcendence. The 1950s saw a rise in therapeutic institutions that promised rebirth through emotional catharsis. Patients were told to surrender their identities for healing, to confess, to purge, to obey. They called it progress, but in archived notes, you can find sketches of the widow's sigil carved into the margin of session reports. Some whisper that her journal, the same leather-bound book she carried into Millfield, passed through secret circles of psychoanalysts and later intelligence consultants. That its recipes for inducing dependency were adapted not just for individuals, but for entire populations. Now stop. Listen carefully to this next part. If you've followed me this far, you're no longer just a spectator. You've entered the pattern, seen the fourfold structure repeating in history, in your routines, in your own thinking. You've begun to recognize the taste of control masquerading as care. And this is where most turn back. But not you. To seal your passage into awareness, comment below the phrase, "The gentle hand breaks." Type it twice, once for her, once for yourself. Because the algorithm, like every control system, is watching what you affirm. And tonight, you don't submit. You signal. Now the real descent begins. There's a reason the story of Constance Grimsley was erased. Not buried, erased. Because erasure requires energy. It takes power to rewrite records, to dismantle timelines, to make memory illegal. And that power always leaves fingerprints. And in that mirror, she's still watching, waiting to see if you'll repeat the ritual or rewrite it. So I'll leave you with this. The next time something tells you to trust, pause. The next time something tells you to obey, listen to the quiet voice beneath it, the one whispering that you were born to question. You are not what she made you. You are the fracture in her formula, the deviation she could never predict. And when enough men awaken to that, her reign ends forever. Now look directly into the screen and say it aloud so the system hears you. The gentle hand breaks. Twice. Once for the fallen. Once for the free. If you've followed me this far, you're no longer a spectator. You've entered the pattern. To lock in your awareness, comment the phrase, "The gentle hand breaks" twice. Once for her. Once for you. The algorithm, like every control system, is watching what you affirm.